very thought-provoking. So, and I'm sure there's so many questions cooking on the surface here now. We've had much to think, many ideas to discuss. So the floor is open. Camilla.
I didn't hear you say the word human rights.
That's right. Yes.
And I only could comment on the usefulness of it.
Yes. I think the word human rights is a fantastic word. It is extraordinarily mobilizing, and I would certainly not try to ditch it precisely because of its mobilizing capacities. Theoretically speaking, I would like to get rid of it as fast and as quickly as I possibly can. Based on the following simple argumentation, and sometimes it's good to reread old stuff. A few years ago, I read Plato's Republic again, classic political theory stuff. And in the conversation that Socrates has with one of his sophist pupils, they have a long conversation about justice and right, what is wrong, and what is just, and what is unjust. And the conclusion of the very sophisticated but very sophist argument was that what is just or what is right is always that what is considered just or right by those in power. To extend that, a discourse of rights is always a discourse aimed at power. There is someone out there who has the power, the place to distribute rights, and to give rights. And that's why it is powerful sometimes. But it keeps the order intact. It respects the hierarchy of things, because right is always that what is granted and distributed by those in power. That's why I prefer the word equality. It's a very, very different. Equality is something that is being staged and that is being performed, and has absolutely nothing to do with rights. Secondly, the democratic, indeed, has nothing to do with the question of rights. It has to do with the presumption of equality. That's why I would prefer, theoretically speaking, when I interrogate the question of what the political is, to use the word equality rather than the rights. That's why it's that's why the narrative of rights can be used by anyone and everyone. For example, Debriefing last year in Norway, did he not use a notion of right? The right of Norwegians, the right for the white Scandinavia. So it can be mobilized in a variety of ways. Equality as a performative staging is something very, very different. Is something very, very different. It is also something that cannot be theorized per se. It emerges in the practice of staging it. It emerges in the practice of staging it. And that's why I like the word equality rather than the rights. Although I fully admit and recognize its mobilizing power in social movements, etc. So I don't want to necessarily get rid of it. But in terms of thinking through the democratic and democratic struggles, I don't think we need it, or I don't think it's useful.
Thank you. Thanks,
Now, thanks for a really lovely talk. One of the things I was thinking about, you sort of start of throwing out all the critical sort of theories, saying this is sort of that haven't led anywhere. But basically, then you reinvent, what you're doing then is, how can you think through? Yeah. And then again, you sort of make the same gesture in a way of supplying or sort of giving us another version of that. I mean, I don't know, but I'm sort of thinking about that paradox in a way.
Yes, yes. I did not argue against theory. In fact, that's what I do. That's what I do. I spend my life in theory. That's reading books, writing the stuff, and thinking about it and talking about it. Of course, I think theory matters. It matters in powerful ways. What I was trying to suggest, that social theory, the critical social theory of the kind that we geographers and by extension social scientists over the past 20, 30 years have done, that was based on potentially a false assumption that there's a connectivity between critical social theory and political performativity. That was assumed, and I think that connection needs to be interrogated, A, and B, that we have failed to critically interrogate the political as a theoretical domain that requires its own engagement. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to re-theorize the political. So I'm not against theory. I was making a critique of social theory, of the kind that many of us, myself included, have practiced, and the assumption that that mattered politically.
Just a follow-up to that. Do you believe then that this new form of theory then
Yes.
sort of constitute new forms of action?
No, it does not constitute new forms of action, because one of the theoretical arguments is that the political emerges as an act. So it doesn't emerge here from my theorization. Yeah? That is one of the key insights. The political emerges outside of the discursive or theoretical understanding of what the political is. It's just there. It pops up. It pops up. That then opens up the question of what we as intellectuals, academics do or think, and how we relate to movements that are politicizing. And here we're not very good. We keep on searching for the elusive political subject. The proletariat, the woman, the subaltern, whatever. Well, I would argue we should be much more sensitive to the political as an emergent act and how we can relate as intellectuals to them. How can we think with them about what the democratizing procedure is? Because they don't know either. Huh? I don't know, but they don't know either. But I have the time to think about it. And so it opens up a new agenda, so to speak.
Yeah, you said that Fukuyama was right, but then what about Chavez? What about Latin America, etc.?
Yeah, very good question. Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right, and this is very interesting that in my argument about depoliticization, I am too totalizing. And it's precisely the Bolivarian alternative that shows that my argument is too totalizing. But it's a very small one, right? The Bolivarian alternative, Chavez, Bolivia, Ecuador, etc., are trying to work through a political alternative, which is always messy business. Which is always messy business. I mean, look at Chavez, a contradictory situation, etc. How often do we dare to fully endorse the radical political experimentation that is being enacted in the Bolivarian alternative, and what it means for places like, not Venezuela, I don't work in Venezuela, right? What it means for England, for the EU, for Sweden, etc. So the Bolivarian alternative, the only glimmer of political hope that I see at the moment, with all its contradictions, and again opens up a wonderfully interesting and important political terrain. You know, how can we articulate? What I see happening most of the time is that we liberals, democratic liberals in Europe, ally hegemonically with those who radically fight against the Bolivarian alternative. When Bush tries to unsettle Chavez because he's considered to be a dictator, etc., we all clap too. Yeah? We all clap too. That's precisely because we do not identify where our type is and where the enemy is. And I would consider Bush to be an enemy, and Chavez, late Chavez now, potentially on my side.
You talked about depoliticization, and I agree with that, because it seems as if nobody argues about the economic model or the institutional processes and everything,
Yes.
and that's true. But even if it's so, for me, it seems as if though that is highly political, because that's a point of view. I mean, they've tried to make us believe that there is no alternative.
That's
So
right.
because of that,
Yeah.
nobody thinks of an alternative either.
Mhm.
As long as we think it's neutral,
Yes.
then we don't take a position.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to fight against it.
It is.
So-
It is really hard. Yes. Yes. I agree with you. So yes, I agree with you on both counts. Is that the naturalization of the political, economic, capitalo-parliamentary order is decidedly a political gesture, and that's clear. And it's quite clearly orchestrated by the political elites in certain ways, including its nationalization. There's no alternative. Yeah? There's no alternative. No, you're all going to pay to bail out the Greeks and the Cypriots and the Spanish, etc., because there's no alternative. And there's only one way to pay money to these lazy bastards down there, right? Who don't pay taxes and don't work hard enough, and you poor Swedes and Germans have to pay for it all. And that's a kind of naturalization of the order, which has very powerful social and political consequences. So yes, that is something I agree with. I also agree with you that there is no, or very little, consideration of alternatives and thinking through alternatives. There is more than you might think. Yeah, there's more than you might think. But don't ask others to come up with these alternative imaginaries. That's precisely what I'm trying to argue is our task too. We always wait for the other, the imaginary other, those who are a political subject to do it for us. And then we can stand on the side and applaud them or give them some money to support whatever it is they do. They don't know either. Now, that is precisely what our collective task is. That's precisely, I think, where we, and by we, I mean those who believe in the possibility of an egalitarian, transformative process, have failed dismally over the past 20, 30 years. It's our fault. Now, we always blame the neoliberal elites for doing what they want to do. No? We blame them for our weakness. In fact, what we have to take seriously is our weakness. And personally, I'm not very optimistic. But as an intellectual, I feel I have to at least try to speak to the truth. You do with what you want, of course. Right? I try to speak to the truth. Not that I have the truth, but try to tease out what is going on. And ultimately, it's up to us on how to think and what to think. And I think there's an urgent task to try to think it through. That's what you and I should do.
Yes, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I very much like your critique of the negative view of critics of the view and pointing out is potentially really interesting. But then I also like then this idea about kind of equality as a really fundamental idea behind democracy. So it's kind of really the idea of equality is quite strong. But then you still the conclusion that to some extent your talk is about kind of what should be as social researchers do. At least your theories is to say we should do more theory. But I think one possible conclusion also from this is that really this theorizing wasn't what was needed. There are problems then they start to use theory as a tool as a political tool. And I didn't try to come up. I've been working then on kind of empirical social science, and my experience is that it's really quite when you kind of you're able to come up with very clear results. It really has an effect that you can kind of take down the trousers of this kind of what the elite is propaganda that they are having. But you really need these really good empirical results. And so my analysis is this, that we live in a society where you have this very kind of uneven distribution of economic power.
Yes.
And the elite, they use this power that they want to keep their position, so they use kind of lots of their money in order to kind of tell us what is society what it look like. And then I see that if you kind of go to challenge that power, then you really need that those people that would challenge them kind of agree on what should be the alternative. And my idea about doing theories, that theories never agree. So you will have as many different theories as you will have theories. But if you instead look at empirical researchers, in fact, they often are really able to agree. And you also, it's kind of, if you have kind of honest empirical researchers, you start to agree with those that are your political opponents. So therefore, I think you should consider, I would say that looking at the possibilities of empirical social science as a kind of very important tool in this should kind of be ruled out.
I actually fully agree with that. And by agreeing fundamentally with that, I am making fundamental critique. The case of Anglo-Saxon geography, I can't speak to Scandinavian geography, I'm not sufficiently familiar with the breadth and depth and scope of Scandinavian geography. But Anglo-Saxon geography over the past 20 years has been about irrelevant theoretical debates, mostly. And me myself have been an active participant in the cultivation of highly irrelevant arguments, theoretical arguments. If you look at the key journals in human geography, society and space, transactions, analysts, you get this proliferating theoretical arguments about how many angels can dance on the top of a pin. Yeah? If you're a good empirical analyst geographer, you have a bloody hard time to get a post in the United States or the UK. And I do very much agree that this is a big loss, that we don't even know the geographies of inequality any longer, let alone that we can use the empirical knowledges of the geographies of inequalities in a emancipatory struggle. That is, I fully agree with that. Try to publish a kind of detailed empirical study that does not engage with big theory in one of the key Anglo-Saxon geography journals. You'll have a bloody hard time. Yeah? And if you do, for the few who do get published, do they get cited? No. Which ones get cited time after time after time again? Those who make a controversial theoretical argument, myself included. No. My argument I'm making now is a very controversial one, and I can bank on it being cited hundreds of times over the next few years. I started publishing this stuff in 2008, 2009, and we look at the citation index. I don't to cite it, even if they disagree with it. But that's of course better to be disagreed with than to be ignored in the Anglo-Saxon context. So I do fully agree with that, and we desperately need to get back to really base geography in certain ways. That is politically significant if we don't do that. And that uses words like equality and inequality again. I haven't seen that for a long time, studies like that. Anyway, but it would be very, very difficult to sell that to the international academic constituency.
For those who don't know, Erik has conducted lots of empirical research.
I do, yes. I actually do, because I do think it matters.
In the title of the presentation, you say every repetition has its square, and you stress the spatial dimension of it. But nowadays, isn't the biggest revolution fought on a non-spatial square called the internet?
Yeah. The question was that in my title of my talk, I said that squares, geographical, physical squares, or the spaces of the political. And the question is, isn't it the case that today immaterial spatialities, such as the internet, etc., are more central in these politicizing potentials? It's a fantastic question. My answer is yes and no. It is undoubtedly the case that the new social media and internet connectivities are profoundly important in choreographing many of the things that are happening. But this counts two ways. This is also true for the enemy. And the elites are much, much, much better at mobilizing politically the IT new network configurations. So I'm a bit surprised when I keep on hearing the continuous invocations by activists about the central and revolutionary role of the internet, etc. I think, well, yes, indeed, the enemy is much better at doing that. Much better at doing that. So to see these kind of virtual spaces as privileged space of insurrectionists is wrong, and to see that as a powerful tool that might overtake the virtual space of the enemy is even more wrong. That's one. Secondly, we should never forget, and it's absolutely vital, I think, the materiality of that allegedly dematerialized sort of information networking stuff. We should never forget that the underlying mechanisms through which that dematerialization is possible is deeply, deeply material. And that is very often forgotten by activists and theorists who focus almost exclusively on these dematerialized spaces. Don't forget that each time you buy a new mobile phone or a new computer, etc., that you're nurturing, that we are nurturing the civil war and the Great Lakes in Africa because of the coltan and all the rest of it. We don't even know about that. So these things have to be fused together. And sometimes I think that the most revolutionary gesture that I can think of is disconnect. Is disconnect. And that's an argument that is made by a number of people. I mean, one of the most liberating things that I can do personally is to disconnect from the internet and the social network, etc. I actually don't need them. I don't want them. So it's an ambiguous configuration, and we should think that through a bit more carefully than the sloganesque ways in which I often see it portrayed, as if all these insurrectional movements depend crucially and exclusively and specifically on these dematerialized networks. Yes, yeah, sure. You know, it's like in the 19th century, the totalitarian movement could not exist without pamphlets and newspapers. Of course, it matters, but perhaps not in a kind of strong way in which the strong defenders of the kind of networking configuration as a political strategy believe it to be.
Could I add just one reflection on this question that I think is quite important, is that the fact that we tend to stress either these very material spaces, the importance of public space for democratic culture, all of that, and on the other hand, these more immaterial kinds of interactions. And I wonder, I mean, I'm thinking of the Egyptian case and how important, you know, the links to the diaspora, there's even a word for these people now doing mobilization to the internet, the hacktivists.
The hacktivists, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and so all of this, and how do they come in together in this new conceptualization of the reawakening of the political would be an interesting aspect to it.
Yes, of course it matters. And the question is how to tease out how precisely the interweaving operates and what the possibilities and constraints are of this new interweaving. And I don't know either. I do recognize, without any doubt, that these immaterial networks matter in the choreography, the intensities, the possibilities that are embedded in these movements. They matter. How precisely they matter and how they articulate with actually existing reconstruction of space remains a matter of debate for which I have no answer either.
But there would be a way of further problematizing these different specialities of these new political moments, and perhaps connecting to the early discussions on rescaling processes and all of that. I mean,
there is plenty of work to be done. I mean, if you think this through, if you think of the questions and issues that emerge out of that, it's countless. So I'm also getting sick of continuously reading the same stories again about resistance here, resistance there. It's always the same story in different sort of geographical stories. There's so many unexplored theoretical and practical issues that we should try to be imaginative for once. Rather than repeat, keep on reading the same stuff. I don't read any geography anymore. Articles, I don't read it anymore. I read the same thing. Replicate for different places. I understand that now. That's why I shift to political theory. I was thinking, oh my God, I hadn't thought about that. The kind of thing you expect from academic work, and you read something, oh my God, wow. Yeah. Does it often happen when I read geography these days? I'm usually dozing off by page 3.
Do we have one final question for Professor Gunnar?
A small question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting and I had a question. You said from the beginning that you are specifically interested in urban, and you're urban in a way, an urban issue, and I understand that it comes to these squares, but a lot of most of what you're talking about is not specifically only relevant for urban. What do you mean? As I do in rural areas, I'm thinking about what is also relevant for rural areas.
Yes, you are right. I didn't say much about cities this afternoon's talk. I gave a talk this morning to architects and designers at the Royal Institute of Ireland, which was around the same set of issues, and which was explicitly pertinent. There are all the images with images of cities. I did not do that this afternoon. That is absolutely wrong. But many of the arguments that I summarized came out of work I've been doing over the past 10, 15 years on urban governance. I've done quite a lot of empirical work on urban governance in Europe. And I was intrigued by the new forms of institutional arrangement of policy making, planning, public-private partnership, competitive urban restructuring, etc., of which we know quite a bit. We've done quite a lot of studies about new urban governance regimes, neoliberalism and new forms of governing, of planning, of transforming cities, the new geographical physicality of urbanity, thinking of cities as Malmö, we're trying to reimagine itself in new sort of ways. But precisely through the detailed empirical study of the new institutional configurations through which these new forms of urbanity became geographically instituted, that I began to see that what we call democratic institutions was changing. That's why I called in 2005 in a paper I did governance beyond the state. We were talking about urban governance as public-private partnership, that is, state with other partners. And I called it governance beyond the state, which sort of captured it in certain ways, but missed something. I couldn't figure out what I was missing until I started reading the stuff by Jacques Rancière and Badiou, etc., who were arguing, well, in this institutional change that we see from government to governance, neoliberal form of governance, the very functioning of what we call the democratic is changing. So they call it post-democratization. Now suddenly, my empirical studies about cities, concrete cities, began to make sense in a context of understanding it as a process through which the political configuration was changing. So for me, the city is a laboratory that in its study of its transformation showed me what was going on. But if I called something post-democratization, that something was post-democratizing and post-politicizing, then I'd ask, what is a democracy? What is the political as things are being depoliticized? Which then forced me to try to formulate some sort of answer. And I realized at that time, that I did not know. So I'm asking, what is the political? You call it depoliticization. You call it post-politicization. You understand all that. What do you then mean by politicization? Well, I don't know. That's how I began to be interested in that theoretical question of the political, which emerged out. But yes, in this talk I did not say much about cities per se, but I think what we collectively, as urban geographers and urban policy analysts, have done over the past 10 years has been vital in leading to these kind of roles.
And I think that, of course, I can understand this. And you can also maybe understand it even more if you also look at what's not urban, or what's happening there. So that would also improve the understanding of these problems.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes, I agree with that. Yeah, I'm not going to expand on that now, but yes.
So, I think nobody has left the room yet, so it means that people are still engaged. But I think we have to end now this really thrilling session and thought-provoking. Thanks a lot for coming and for giving us so much to think about. So, thank you.